Friendship can be defined as a mutual relationship in which those involved influence one another's behaviors and beliefs. And the quality of a friendship is defined as the satisfaction that one gets from that relationship. So, having a good friendship is definitely going to boost your self esteem and your happiness. And having good friendships also helps you to socialize better, opening up doors and making new opportunities for making even more friends. So, it's kind of like a snowball effect. If you have one or two good friends, then you're likely to have even more friends later on. But when it comes to adult friendships, those work a bit differently than they do in childhood and adolescence. Adult friendships tend to develop over several stages, as described by the ABCDE model. So A refers to acquaintanceship, when you're first getting to know the person, deciding whether or not you want to be their friend. B refers to the build-up, where you're just spending more and more time with them, you're learning more about them, you're just becoming better friends over time. C refers to continuation. So this is the point at which you feel comfortable in the relationship. You don't really feel pressured to learn more about this person. You enjoy their company, but you don't really need to get to know them anymore. You've moved past that point. And this is where a lot of adult relationships kind of sit for quite a long time. Then eventually they might move to stage D. D is deterioration. So this is where you just kind of lose touch with the person. This is where you just spend less and less time with them. You stop inviting them to parties, they stop calling you, you're kind of losing touch. And then the last stage, stage E, is not very commonly reached. It's unfortunate that a lot of adult relationships, a lot of adult friendships will get into the stage D of deterioration, but that doesn't mean the relationship is ending. It just means it's deteriorating, it's degrading, it's becoming less of a meaningful relationship, but it's not officially over. Many friendships will reach this stage, unfortunately, but typically you won't get to stage E unless you find a viable alternative. So this kind of sounds a little heartless, but what I'm saying here is, or what the research is showing here, is that people would rather have a bad relationship where they rarely ever get to see that person. They'd rather have that kind of bad relationship than no relationship at all. The thought of being socially isolated is so unpleasant that people will stick with these bad relationships instead. Now, in adulthood, people make friends with others for different reasons. There's different friendship themes. Research has identified 3 of these themes. So some adult friendships are based on affectional or emotional needs. This desire for self-disclosure, expressions of intimacy, appreciation, support. These are the relationships that involve a lot of trust and commitment, where you're sharing yourself and your very personal feelings with someone else. Other relationships are based on a shared interest theme. So this is where you just have mutual interest in activities. Like maybe you like to play the same games, maybe you like to watch the same TV shows, whatever it might be. And then the third theme of adult friendships is sociability, or you could just call it compatibility. This is just a fancy way to say, how much fun is this person to be around? Do you enjoy spending time with this person? So some friendships simply exist because you find the person fun to hang around with. So all adult relationships tend to be focused on one of these 3 themes. Of course, you could, go between them, but most adult friendships have a primary theme. Now, when we look at the gender difference in how adults pursue friendships and what kinds of themes we tend to see in these adult friendships, women tend to base their friendships more so often on those intimacy, those affectional, emotional needs. So women tend to look for other women to share their life with, to share their feelings with. Men, more often, and we're referring to the United States, but this is true for many countries, men tend to base their friendships more often on shared interest. So they tend to not be as, intimate with their friends. They tend to not want to share their feelings with their friends because in a lot of cultures like ours, that's just something that men aren't expected to do. And in fact, men are not supposed to do those kinds of things according to a lot of our cultural norms. But there is a loophole in these cultural norms in many societies, and that is a man can have these more intimate relationships, but if it's with a woman instead of a man. So men shouldn't talk about their feelings with other men, but it's okay for men to talk about their feelings with a woman. So as a result, cross-sex friendships can be especially beneficial to men. It gives men an outlet to share those feelings that they have with someone who will listen and someone who will likely understand them. And it won't get, all awkward and stuff. So yes, men tend to get a lot out of cross-sex friendships in that regard. However, I'm sure you understand, cross-sex friendships can be problematic if one or both of those individuals gets into a romantic relationship with someone else. Like you might see some jealousy pop up, some, paranoia issues. So just be mindful. If you are interested in pursuing a cross-sex friendship, just make sure you're not going to freak out your boyfriend or girlfriend in the process. Now, one of the most popular theories about how relationships work in a broad sense comes from Robert Sternberg. So this is what we call the triangular theory of love. We call it the triangular theory because it posits that there's three different kinds of love. You have passion, those deep emotional and or like sexual feelings you have towards a person. Intimacy, which refers to those feelings of connectedness and affection. And commitment, which refers to this determination to stay in a long-term relationship with this person. This kind of dedication you have to being there for that person. Now, when we look at any kind of relationship, whether it's just friends or whether it's a married couple or anything else, we generally see that couple, that those individuals in that relationship tend to be a lot happier if they feel these three kinds of love in equal amounts. So if you have a lot of passion for your lover and they have a lot of passion for you, that's going to be great. You have that thing in common. You have that kind of relationship in common. But if there's some kind of imbalance, like if you're a lot more passionate than they are, or if you're a lot more intimate than they are, it's going to eventually lead to some problems, most likely. And just in general, the longer a relationship lasts, the lower the intimacy tends to become, and the lower the passion tends to become. But the commitment typically will steadily increase over time. So here's one way to depict the triangular theory of love. You see, we have intimacy, passion, and commitment. Those are very basic kinds of love, but they can all be combined in various ways. So if you were to combine intimacy and passion, you would get romance, romantic love. If you combine intimacy and commitment, then you get what we call companionate love. I like to call this like a best friendship kind of a love. And if you combine passion with commitment, now you get something we could call fatuous love. This is like a sexual obsession, like a long-term crush on somebody. And then if you combine all three, that's what we call consummate love. Now, depending on these three kinds of love, depending on how much you feel of each kind, then we could describe that in different ways. Like if you have some intimacy for a person, but that's all, like you feel some intimacy towards them, you want to get to know them, you want to, you know, share your life with them, we would just say that you like that person. You know, if you ever say you like somebody, that just means you have this intimacy feeling. If your relationship is based entirely on passion, like you don't necessarily have any sense of commitment and you don't really want to get to know the person, you just can't help but think about them in these sexual or, you know, emotional ways, we just call that like infatuation, like a crush, basically. So that's if you only have passion. And then if you only have that commitment, if you only have that sense of commitment that you need to be there for them, but you lack intimacy and passion, that's something we call empty love. And you can see how a relationship could start off as just a liking kind of relationship, and you could also see how it could start off as a infatuation, and then it could grow to be more complex from either one of those starts. But it's hard to see how a relationship could start off as empty love, and the answer is it can't. That's usually not how it works. By far, that's not how it works. What normally happens is the relationship does start off as either liking that person or being infatuated with that person. It grows more complex over time, and then as I said earlier, you know, the longer a relationship lasts, the lower the passion and the intimacy tend to become, and the greater the commitment tends to become. So what I'm saying is we typically only see empty love relationships in long-term relationships, you know, towards the end of those long-term relationships. So it's kind of sad, but yeah, a lot of long-term relationships do end up that way. You know, you're only staying with the person because you feel like you should. You don't really want to be with them. You don't really like them all that much. You just feel that commitment. But that's kind of depressing, so let's not talk about that. So relationships will start off as either just liking the person or being infatuated, and then they'll grow to be more complex. And if you have both of those, you know, that intimacy and passion, that will develop into romantic love. But romantic love doesn't have that element of commitment just yet. If you do spend a lot of time with this person, but you never develop those sexual feelings, those, you know, romantic, emotional kind of feelings, then that could just develop into like a best friend kind of love. You know, I already described that. That's called companionate love. And then fatuous love, that's when you have this, you know, sexual obsession, basically. It's like a long-term crush, so to say, where you have a lot of passion and commitment, but you don't really want to be friends with the person. You could see examples of this in like a celebrity crush, for example. Like if there's some celebrity that you've been like putting posters on your wall and thinking about for many, many years in this kind of, you know, romantic way, that's exactly what I mean. You know, people just have these sexual, long-term sexual ideas that they get stuck in their head. But good, healthy relationships tend to have all three of these basic types of love. They have intimacy, passion, and commitment in relatively equal degrees, and that's what we call consummate love. So consummate love is what we find in those healthy, stable, and long-lasting relationships. A good way to describe consummate love is just if you ever hear somebody say something like, "I'm so happy I got to marry my best friend." That's what consummate love looks like. But how we find people, how we start to develop these relationships with others has definitely changed dramatically and is continuing to change as we go into the future. You know, not too long ago, speed dating was like a really popular thing to do. So speed dating is where just a bunch of people get together in one like restaurant or one area, and they have a bunch of like micro dates where they just introduce themselves, they get to know the person a little bit, and in that short period of time, they have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to follow up with this person on a second date, you know, like a full-length date. So these kinds of things used to be pretty popular, and they were, you know, pretty effective for a lot of individuals. But obviously, when you only get to spend a short amount of time with a person, they're not going to get to know you that well. So when it comes to these like micro dates, what we generally would see is that people who are more attractive, more outgoing, and more self-assured, those are the ones that would get the second date. Nowadays, we've kind of done this, but we've transitioned to an online format. So online dating is now very common in our country, and it's becoming pretty common in a lot of countries. If you do use any online services like Tinder, for example, if you do any of these kinds of things to try to look for somebody to go out on a date with, I just want to make something very clear. I'm sure you already understand this if you've ever used these platforms, but just like these micro dates, just like speed dating, the most important thing is being physically attractive and being outgoing and self-assured. So you need to have a good profile picture, to put it simply. You need to exude attractiveness and, confidence, basically. That's what's going to get people to swipe right. I don't know. I've never used Tinder, but they'll choose you, basically. So it might sound a little, I don't know, bad, I suppose, but the point is, if you want somebody to get to know you, if you want somebody to see your inner beauty, you need to show them your outer beauty first. That's what's going to get their attention initially. Now, as I mentioned, when you do start dating somebody, it's going to start off as a pretty simple relationship. Like maybe there's a little bit of passion there, maybe there's a little bit of intimacy there, but as the relationship continues, it's going to naturally grow more complex. If it doesn't grow more complex, then you'll find that you're not really interested in that relationship anymore, and you'll probably break it off pretty soon. Infatuation is relatively short-lived. So this is why we generally see much higher divorce rates in people who get married very early into their relationship. Like one of the worst things you can do is get married to somebody the same day you meet them. That's just ridiculous. So please spend a lot of time, take your time to get to know the person, and if you still have a lot of passion and if you still feel really intimate towards them after, I don't know, a few months to a year, then maybe it is a good idea to get married. But just take your time. You're in no rush here. Now, one common myth that people like to spread around is opposites attract, but that couldn't be further from the truth. When you're out there looking for somebody to make a relationship with, generally you want to look for somebody who's a lot like you. So if you've ever heard the phrase birds of a feather flock together, that's exactly what the research supports. It's something we call the Assortative Mating Theory. So the whole idea here is that people find partners and people value those partners based on their similarity to themselves across many dimensions. So we look for people who have similar education levels, we look for people who have similar religious ideas, similar level of physical attractiveness, similar level of intelligence and socioeconomic status, similar political opinions and shopping habits, and so on. So the more similar you are to this other person, the more attractive generally they will appear to be, and the more likely that relationship is going to work out in the long run. So when you're looking for somebody, what the research would show you is that the best place to find somebody like you is to go to places that you normally go. Like if you spend a lot of time or hanging around campuses, well, you probably don't nowadays because of, virus and all that. But if you do spend a lot of time hanging around college campuses and things like that, then that's where you should look for somebody. People like you probably are attending the same college. So other places you might find somebody like you is like a workplace or like a church or any other kind of place that you tend to frequent. So please don't go out of your comfort zone when you're looking for somebody to form a relationship with. You should stay in your comfort zone. You should look for people who've come to your comfort zone because it's probably their comfort zone too. And that's a great place to get started. Now, just to change the subject a little bit, uh, when it comes to what people look for in a relationship, we can actually look to Charles Darwin for some advice. Now, Charles Darwin, of course, is famous for doing his research on evolution of species. And he actually had two theories. His theory of natural selection, which explains how species change over time due to pressure from the environment. And he also, much later, came up with the theory of sexual selection. So this refers to how species change over time due to mating pressures, mating demands. And this theory of sexual selection explains why we have such a big difference between the genders of many species, humans included. To put it simply, when you look at the animal kingdom, if you ever see an attractive animal, pretty colors, big, decorations like big antlers, whatever, big fluffy mane. Whenever you see these kinds of decorations, whenever you see these pretty animals, it's usually a boy. It's the males of the species that have to put on the big show. It's the males of the species that have to sell themselves as a viable mate. And the females of most species will choose which mate they think is the best. So males are always competing for the female's attention, for the female's, affection. So we see that in humans, we see that in lions, definitely see that in birds. But yeah, the whole idea here is when the females choose a mate based on these kinds of features, that those features are selected and passed on to future generations. So the pretty colors in birds, the large antlers in, deer or whatever, the reason why we see those so prominently in the males is because the girls find them hot, to put it simply. That's what they like, so that's what gets passed on to their children. But when we think about this in terms of humans, what we see is a pretty big split in how the two genders choose a mate. So women look for these kinds of things, these indicators of health and well-being and just, physical beauty, which is usually related to that. But women also look for other factors, psychological factors, behavioral factors that indicate that this mate is a good choice. So being dependable, being reliable. The females need to pay attention to all those factors because it's not good enough just to have a healthy child. That child needs to be raised properly and grow up and have their own children. So women are paying attention to all these different factors when it comes to choosing a mate. Men, for most species, that's not really the case. For a lot of species, the men will just take whatever they can get. But if we want to be precise, male humans, what they tend to look for, and what many species tend to look for, are signs of youth and physical health. So, once again, attractiveness. So these are the things men tend to prefer. Those other things, like being reliable, males of most species don't tend to focus on that as much. So, but this is kind of oversimplifying things. Women can pursue a relationship for a number of different reasons. If they're just looking to have a good time, then they do tend to focus more so on those physical attributes, that beauty I was describing. Men with the big burly muscles and, all kinds of other attractive, like masculine features. Women who are just interested in having a good time, they tend to prefer more masculine looking men. But if a woman wants to start a family, if she wants to raise some children, then typically those things, while they are valued, those aren't the kinds of things that she's going to put the emphasis on. When she wants to have children, when she wants to start a family, she's going to put a much stronger emphasis on those behavioral traits I was describing. Being dependable, being a good provider, that kind of stuff. So less masculine men tend to be preferred for long-term relationships. Now, there are, of course, more factors than just these genetically inherited instincts. there are, of course, cultural influences. Culture always plays a role when it comes to how humans interact with each other. So when it comes to love and relationships, we find that there seem to be two dimensions for mate preference. This comes from research by Buss et al. They looked at 37 different cultures, and those two dimensions they found were the kind of cultural values the society has and what degree of intellectual refinement they prefer. So here's just an example. This isn't the data from the study. This is just an illustration of what the data looked like. So you see some countries prefer, the individuals of some cultures prefer more intellectual refinement. That's much more important than having a pleasing disposition. In other words, it's better to be smart. It's better to be educated and, proper than it is to just be fun. Being fun is not so important. And then in cultures like Sweden, for example, it's important that the individual is much more progressive than traditional. In other words, they need to be flexible. They need to be willing to try new things and try to develop better ways to do things. It's kind of hard to give you a simple example besides, this is kind of an extreme example, but if you were to meet somebody in Sweden and this was the first time you ever had a relationship, they would probably be turned off by that. They would see you as a child, somebody who's immature. They don't want to be in a relationship with somebody who's never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend before. That's just not attractive to them. But if you come from a more traditional society, they probably wouldn't even consider spending time with you if you had been tainted. If you had had sex with somebody before, they would see you as ruined or soiled or something like that. So those are just complete opposite ends of this spectrum. And this particular issue that I'm discussing is, of course, chastity. That has shown a lot of variability across cultures. So here in the United States, I would say we're fairly, we've got a lot of different cultures here, but we're fairly towards the progressive side, and I think more so towards the pleasing disposition side. But if you want to see all the details from the study itself, you can always look it up on, Google Scholar or something like that. It's a pretty interesting field of research. Now, when it comes to how love is processed in the brain, that neural circuitry that's involved, what we see is that there's a lot of overlap between the different kinds of love. So while love does seem to be kind of a singular thing, it does seem to have these different branches. Like love does seem to be a distinct neurological emotion system with different stages involving different kinds of neurochemicals. So, for example, when you think about your new boyfriend or your new girlfriend, somebody you just started dating a few days ago, you'll probably feel a lot of excitement and pleasure. That comes from amphetamines and dopamine. So amphetamines, those are those excitement chemicals, and dopamine is the pleasure chemicals, and those play an important role in early stages of love. But over time, as you start to become more attached to this person, as you start to develop a stronger sense of intimacy and commitment with this person, you'll see higher levels of oxytocin. That's that attachment hormone. So this is the kind of feeling you get when you're snuggling your boyfriend, or this is kind of feeling you get when you're cuddling with a baby, your baby. This oxytocin is very important for developing a healthy relationship with somebody else, and it actually has been shown to enhance the orgasms for females. Like females can have a much more pleasing sexual experience if they've developed this sense of intimacy with someone that they're with. Now, what we're talking about with all of this, of course, is Erik Erikson's stage 6. So this is the big focus of the early adult years, that intimacy versus isolation. So what Erickson was basically just trying to say is the primary focus of early adult life is just developing a strong relationship with other people, at least a few other people. It doesn't need to be a romantic relationship, but this is what most young adults are predominantly focused on. And how people go about doing this, it varies for a lot of the reasons I already mentioned. Like, people have these genetic instincts that drive them, they have these cultural biases that drive them, but we also just, the way we treat people in our relationship, the way we create these relationships with others is largely based on observational learning. So we tend to imitate a lot of the behaviors that we see other people perform, especially those of our parents. So we tend to pursue the same kind of relationship that we see our parents have, and we tend to act in that relationship in the same way we saw our parents do. So this might sound a little depressing, but if you do have, unfortunately, parents who fight a lot, there's a lot of parental conflict, that's something you've probably picked up, and that's probably something that you'll see in your own future. Of course, you can try to recognize when you're doing that and put an end to it, but I'm just saying, you learn how to do relationships by watching your parents, mostly. But parental conflict in particular, that can lead to a lot of violence, unfortunately. Some relationships, the conflict is just minor. Parents just argue. It's pretty normal. But it can become abusive. Now, an abusive relationship can be simply defined as just when one of the partners becomes violent or aggressive. And we typically see the men as the perpetrators here. It can go either way. Women can be the violent abuser, but typically because of men's naturally higher testosterone levels and other like cultural factors and things like that, we generally see men as the ones who become violent and aggressive. And this is why we tend to call this particular thing battered woman syndrome. But like I was saying, it can also apply to men. So battered woman syndrome is when a woman believes that, well, she knows she's in an abusive relationship, but she believes she can't leave. She believes there's no escape. And oftentimes, unfortunately, she's probably right. If she runs away, if she calls the cops, it's not going to solve the problem, and it's probably just going to make things worse. Unfortunately, in a lot of these cases of battered woman syndrome, escape seems so far away that she might take, extreme measures where she will, kill her abuser or maybe herself. So that's incredibly sad, but that we do see that from time to time in these very abusive relationships. But when it comes to abuse, it's kind of a hard subject to talk about because it's not like a yes-no kind of thing. Abuse is a continuum. This kind of violent, aggressive behavior should be looked at as a continuum. So where you are on that continuum can vary over time, and it's really hard to know where to draw the line. Like, is arguing frequently with your spouse, is that abuse? Or do you only define it as abuse if people start actually throwing punches? Like, it's just a little bit hard to determine exactly where the real problems start. And usually at the point where you realize you're in a really bad situation, that's when you're already experiencing that battered woman syndrome. That's where you already can't find a way out. So I'm not trying to, make relationships seem terrible or anything like that. I'm just saying this does happen, unfortunately. And one interesting side note is that heterosexual couples tend to see this more often than homosexual couples. I can't give you an exact reason why that's the case, but one obvious thing is that homosexual couples probably just have a lot more in common. They probably understand each other a bit better. There's no gender barrier between them, so they can just relate better, resulting in less abuse, less violence. Now, just like how culture plays a big role when it comes to finding a mate and, how you value that potential mate. Culture also plays a big role when it comes to this issue of violence. Culture particularly relates to the severity and probability of physical abuse being a part of the relationship. So some cultures, we just see this a lot more often than others. And these cultures tend to emphasize things like the concept of female purity, being chaste until marriage, male status, if that's a big emphasis in the culture, concepts like family honor, and things like that. So these kinds of cultures that put emphasis on these kinds of things, they tend to just have higher rates of violence against women. And how this manifests can be pretty variable, but some common things we've seen are concepts like sexual slavery. We see that more often in these more like traditional cultures, I guess you could say, where women are viewed as property to be bought and sold. Something that I really don't like talking about because it's considered a harmful cultural practice that's banned in the United States is called female circumcision. So this is, I'm trying to be as nice about it as I can, but this is a horrible thing, and I'll just say what it is. Female circumcision is when people will surgically mutilate a young girl's genitals in the attempt to preserve chastity. So yeah, you're only going to see that kind of stuff in these cultures that put a strong emphasis on chastity. And then, while this seems like an oxymoron to me, like it just doesn't make any sense to me, in some of these more traditional cultures, you also see cases of honor killing or honor raping, where when one family's honor is besmirched or something, they might demand this kind of sacrifice in the form of murder or rape. Like, I just don't see how there could be anything honorable about this kind of stuff, but I'm not from these cultures, so I can't really explain it that well. So the sad thing about all this, though, is in a lot of these cultures who do practice these kinds of beliefs and do sponsor these kinds of behaviors, we generally don't hear about the worst stuff, because it's normal there. It's considered perfectly normal to do this kind of stuff in those cultures. So the women, it's usually the women who suffer. They unfortunately suffer in silence.